In December 1952, more people died in London in 5 days than in other European cities in an entire year. The city wasn't being bombed. There was no war, no earthquake, no flood. London was simply breathing, and that was what was killing it. Before the disaster, by the mid-20th century, London was burning coal on an industrial scale that Eveline could never have imagined. 56 coal-fired power plants operated within the city itself, 56 inside the city limits, industrial plants, factories, locomotives, and most importantly, residential fireplaces. In London alone, there were about 1 million coal-burning fireplaces in residential homes. In winter, on a cold day, they were all lit at the same time. The fog in London was an ancient and familiar phenomenon. It was called pea souper for its thickness and yellowish color. Londoners were used to it. It was part of the city's folklore, part of its identity. Sherlock Holmes walked through it with a lantern. The Impressionists painted it. No one perceived it as a threat. But what was looming in early December of '52 was different. The beginning. On December 5th, 1952, a high-pressure system settled over Britain. A high-pressure system is an area of high pressure in which air does not rise vertically, but on the contrary, is pressed downward. This creates what is known as a temperature inversion. Warm air ends up above cold air, and between them, like a lid on a pot, an invisible barrier forms. Everything emitted into the air from below, smoke, soot, sulfur dioxide, coal particles, simply could not escape. It remained below and accumulated. The first signs appeared by the evening of December 5th. The fog was unusual. It didn't just reduce visibility, it had a smell, a sharp chemical smell, like rotten eggs. It was sulfur dioxide reacting with the moist air and turning into tiny droplets of sulfuric acid. By the morning of December 6th, visibility in central London had dropped to a few meters. Bus drivers couldn't see the road. Conductors walked in front of the buses with lanterns, lighting the way. Some routes were completely cancelled. The London Underground continued to operate normally during those days. Passengers emerging from the subway onto the surface literally bumped into a wall of smog. Inside the stations, according to eyewitness accounts, the smog even penetrated the platforms. It was visible in the light of the street lamps. Disaster. On December 7th, the situation turned catastrophic. Smithfield, the famous London livestock market, was hosting its annual show of pedigree animals. Cows began to collapse. Veterinarians diagnosed acute respiratory failure. The first to die was a prize-winning bull, the show's champion, whom his owner had brought from Shropshire. People began covering the animals with blankets and trying to get them out of the city. Many could not be saved. It would later be discovered that the smog also contained fluorine, a byproduct of industrial operations. It was this substance that proved particularly deadly to cattle. That same night, the opera La Traviata was being performed at Sadler's Wells Theatre. The smog seeped into the auditorium through the ventilation system. Audience members in the back rows could not see the stage. Not metaphorically, the performance was stopped halfway through. People began to leave, covering their mouths with scarves. Hospitals began to fill up. Patients were admitted with acute attacks of bronchitis, asthma, and pneumonia. But at first, doctors did not link this to the smog. Winter, the flu, the usual seasonal pattern. On December 8th and 9th, the smog reached its peak concentration. The concentration of sulfur dioxide in the air exceeded the norm by 7 times. The concentration of particulate matter by 9 times. By modern standards, the air in central London during those days would have been deemed unfit for breathing without respiratory protection. The police reported a sharp rise in the number of robberies and thefts. Criminals had realized the obvious. It was easier to operate in zero visibility. Some of those apprehended simply got lost in the smog while fleeing from the police, and were later found wandering in a completely different neighborhood. Morgues were overflowing. Undertakers reported a shortage of coffins. Florists reported a shortage of flowers. On December 9th, the high-pressure system began to shift. The wind came from the west. The smog began to dissipate. By the morning of December 10th, London could breathe again. After the disaster, Official statistics for the first few weeks indicated 4,000 excess deaths. Winston Churchill's government accepted this figure and wanted to close the matter there. Health Minister Ian McNeill stated in public speeches that no extraordinary measures were required and that the increased mortality rate was due to the flu and the cold winter. This was a lie, or perhaps it was a convenient delusion that no one was in a hurry to refute. Independent researchers, in particular Dr. Logan, a physician and epidemiologist who had worked at the Ministry of Health, began compiling their own statistics. He compared mortality data for London in December 1952 with data from the same periods in previous years. The picture was horrific. The actual death toll, that is, the number of people who died specifically because of the smog, rather than those who would have died anyway, ranged from 10 to 12,000. Some later studies cite a figure of 12,000. This is comparable to the casualties in certain military operations during World War II. Another 150,000 people suffered serious damage to their respiratory systems. Most of them did not die immediately. In the first few days, many died over the course of the following weeks and months. This is precisely why people were so reluctant to acknowledge the disaster as a disaster for so long. The deaths were spread out over time. Solution: 4 years of parliamentary debates, journalistic investigations, and petitions from doctors and scientists. Churchill personally blocked the adoption of strict measures because the coal industry was one of the pillars of the British economy, and imposing restrictions on coal burning threatened enormous costs. The turning point came in 1956. The Clean Air Act was passed. It established smog-free zones in cities, banned the use of unprocessed coal in home fireplaces within city limits, and tightened requirements for industrial emissions. Businesses were given subsidies to switch to cleaner fuels. It was the world's first comprehensive law on urban air quality. It served as a model for environmental legislation in dozens of other countries. Conclusion: the disaster didn't come out of nowhere. Coal was being burned, the air was being polluted, and people were coughing. Everyone knew this. There simply wasn't the political will to stop it. The official figures were deliberately underreported. 4,000 versus 12. That is not a mistake or a statistical error. It is narrative management, and it worked for 4 years. Animals died before people spoke out in full force. Bulls at the Smithfield Fair fell in the early days. That could have been a warning sign. It went unheard. The Great London Smog is not a story about a natural disaster. It is a story about what happens when industrial progress outpaces responsibility, when convenience, a warm fireplace, cheap coal, a functioning factory, becomes more important than the consequences. Today, London is one of the world's cleanest megacities in terms of air quality, but this status cost 12,000 lives and 4 years of refusing to acknowledge the obvious.